from Delhi. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depends upon where you are right now. It's indeed an honor to invite you all today to this online conference titled Mysore Global Forum, which focuses on India's role, emerging role in the neighboring countries especially, but also far beyond that. For the last few series of lectures, we invited professors from academics and also some diplomats from their experienced diplomats. But today is a very special day for Mysore Global Forum, which is organized jointly by University of Mysore IR Department and a think tank in Delhi, BRICS Institute. My name is Dr. Vinod Singh Azad Satru, and I was a PhD student in China when I had the privilege of visiting our embassy in Beijing, which is housed in a very good new building. And Ambassador Ashok Kant, who is the distinguished respected speaker today, he had just joined from Sri Lanka to China. That was a very interesting posting because in the past also there were trends like that, and the people like we got some clear picture of how Sri Lanka or China or India or South Asian politics is getting, intermixed. So today, as a kind of opening of this conference, I have just few lines to share. After that, I'll be handing over the forum to Madam Bharti Hiremat, who is the head of Department of IR at University of Mysore. In the beginning, I also would like to bring in our panelist, Professor S.I. Kita Ponchalan. He is a distinguished professor at University of Salisbury in Maryland in United States of America. Before that, he was, of course, heading the Department of Political Science in Colombo University, which is the best university in Sri Lanka, no doubt. Last week, we had a very candid conversation where we mostly focused on political situation of Sri Lanka, being a political scientist, Professor Kita Ponchalan. But then the role of India came up, and Professor Kita Ponchalan raised some issues of India's role in Sri Lanka, which we didn't rebut. We just carried it forward. And today, Ambassador Sir, there were a few points that after the 80s, our experience, what role India has been playing in Sri Lanka in terms of ensuring Sri Lanka's political, economic, and cultural stability. That was a point where we disagreed a little bit with Professor Kita Ponchalan. And today we request Ambassador Sir to give us a first-hand view of how, sir, you manage Sri Lanka, you manage China, you manage Malaysia. I think you manage relations with many countries in a very amicable way, in a kind of Buddha style, always smiling. And I remember whenever we have some function in embassy in Beijing, whether it's Independence Day or Republic Day, you'll be the last one to take some snacks. I was just watching that. That kind of guardianship is rare in our diplomatic corps. And that's why we inspired. And after coming back to India, sir, you have been very active, being a distinguished scholar at VIF, Vivekananda International Foundation, and also reviving ICS to become one of the top 10 think tanks in India, not only on China, but on different aspects, sir. Many students from our group has got opportunity to work under you, to be guided by you, sir. You have also, put ICS on a global map by shining some exchange program with Harvard University, Harvard Yenching a scholarship, and many other milestones. So time doesn't allow me to, sir, read out all the biography. I'm sure my colleagues at University of Mysore have prepared a brief note about you. But, sir, there are a few points which we would like to hear from you is that what is the mechanism where India comes out very fast with a loan sanction of credit line of, huge billions of dollars in terms of extending to neighboring countries, whether it might be sometime Nepal, this time it is Sri Lanka, when IMF, World Bank, and other big powers, they are still considering whether to help Sri Lanka, to help in what extent. So in that, is it our diplomatic community or diplomatic role is very active when it comes to crisis in our neighborhood in South Asia? That is one of the points, sir. And the second point is that, do you see that Sri Lankan political system can have some lessons from Indian political system in terms of their parliamentary democracy, which is not very strong, in terms of their corruption, and in terms of the outside influence they have been allowing for the last 1 decade. So I just take a break here, sir. I hand over the session to Madam Bharti Hiremat, who is based right now in Mysore. She'll be the moderator today. and she will take the discussion further. Once again, sir, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to our students and our colleagues on this forum. You are most welcome, sir. We look forward to your speech.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Binod, for giving an opportunity to moderate this session. Sir, warm welcome to you all, sir. Today we have a very outstanding personalities, Ambassador Ashok Kant and Professor Kita Ponchalan and Brigadier Rajkumar, sir, to discuss on political and economic crisis and India's role, how best India can help. And, being in a continental countries, we should know each other, and we should be helpful to each other in their dangerous condition, in their critical condition. But it is a very sad to see that being in very immediate and neighboring country, Sri Lanka under great crisis, and there is a political instability and unstable government. What are the causes for the instability? Sudden fall in the government, sudden fall in the economic condition, and it's not an incident which took in overnight. There may be so many causes behind this. We want to know, sir, we have so many queries regarding the political instability or corruption in the government. Suddenly, whole cabinet resigned. It's not an easy matter, and there may be a serious issues in behind this political instability. And being in a democratic country, India, how it can help to Sri Lanka, and how Sri Lanka is looking at India. Being a neighboring country, Sri Lanka, is it possible to get influence in future from the democratic principles of India? No, always, as we know, always Sri Lanka will be under great influence of China and some other countries. And maybe, some extent, some external powers are they having a role in, political and economic crisis of Sri Lanka? And what best, Sri Lanka can do to come out from this, great crisis? And is there any, changes? Can we have a hope in a political restructure and, reformation of the government in Sri Lanka? And what are the way outs for Sri Lanka to come out from this crisis? We have so many, queries, and I hope we will get the answer from Ambassador sir, Ponchalan sir is there. And I hope my student also will be benefited by your discussion, sir. And I request one of my students, Penal, to introduce outstanding personality, Ambassador Ashok Kant, sir. Penal, over to you, Oba.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Good evening to one and all present here. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, respected Mr. Ashok Kant, sir, who is going to talk on the topic Economic and Political Crisis in Sri Lanka and India's Role. Respected Mr. Ashok Kant, sir, joined as Director of the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi on 31st March 2017. A career diplomat, sir was Ambassador of India to China until January 2016. Prior to this, he was Secretary East at the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi with responsibility for about 65 countries in India's extended neighborhood. His previous assignments include High Commissioner of India to Sri Lanka and Malaysia, Consulate General in Hong Kong, Deputy Chief of Mission in Kathmandu, Nepal, and Joint Secretary East Asia in Ministry of External Affairs. Earlier, Sir served in different capacities at Indian missions in Singapore, China, and the USA, and at headquarters in New Delhi. In his diplomatic career spanning over 38 years, Sir specialized in Asian affairs with a particular focus on China. Apart from 3 assignments in China, he served as Joint Secretary and Director China at Ministry of External Affairs for periods of 4 years each, closely involved in the formulation and implementation of India's foreign policy in respect of China and East Asia. Sir is profound and fluent in Chinese Mandarin language. Sir joined the Indian Foreign Service in the year 1977. So it's a great honor for me to welcome you, sir. I would say it's a great honor for me to welcome you on behalf of my department. I wholeheartedly welcome you, sir. I would also like to invite our second speaker, Dr. Kita Ponchalan, sir. Dr. Kita Ponchalan is a professor of conflict resolution at Salisbury University, Maryland. He was chair of the Conflict Analysis and Dispute Resolution Department from 2011 to 2018. Before joining Salisbury University in 2011, he was a professor of political science and public policy at the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. Dr. Kita Ponchalan has also served as researcher at several international institutions, including the United Nations Institute for Disarmament and Research in Geneva and the United Nations University in Tokyo. He served as a consultant to Sri Lanka projects of several international agencies. Sir has published widely on conflict and peace-related issues in Sri Lanka and South Asia. Finally, I would welcome Kita Ponchalan, sir, as well. It's a great honor for me and my department to have you here, sir. The platform is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Peenal. Sir, Brigadier Rajput, sir, you are most welcome to our panel discussion. Sir, Ashok, sir, we have, as I told you, we have multiple, queries to get to know about the Sri Lanka, as it is a very immediate neighboring country, and it's not a mere backwater. It is our neighboring country. We should know what is happening in Sri Lanka and what is the role of India in connection with this crisis, sir. Sir, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Hiremat, for inviting me to address Mysore Global Forum. And I would also like to thank Dr. Binod Singh for his remarks and for a very generous introduction which was given for me. It's a topic which is of great interest to us at this point of time. Sri Lanka is passing through its biggest economic crisis since independence in 1948. And that crisis has morphed into a political crisis as well. As someone who lived in Sri Lanka from 2009 until 2013 and worked as High Commissioner of India to that country, I have been watching these developments with empathy and concern. I'm not at all surprised that India is playing a large role in addressing challenges that Sri Lanka is facing today. That's in keeping with our neighborhood first policy, and also given extensive historical, societal, economic, security, and political linkages we have between India and Sri Lanka. I can say without any hesitation that the vital interests, strategic interests of India and Sri Lanka are closely intertwined. And what happens in Sri Lanka has a direct bearing on our national interests and vice versa. Dr. Bharti Hiremat and Dr. Binod Singh have raised a number of questions. I'll try and answer those questions to the extent possible within short time available. Let me begin by making this point, or rather reiterating this point, that what we are witnessing in Sri Lanka today is an economic crisis, which has triggered a major political crisis and stalemate. This economic crisis, as Dr. Hiremat mentioned, didn't happen overnight. It was building up for quite some time. It's a combination of structural problems and legacy issues in the economy, impact of a series of developments, including, Easter Sunday bombings in 2019, the onset and impact of the COVID beginning March 2020, and now the Ukrainian crisis, along with some very serious mismanagement of economy and corruption. So all this, the legacy factors, some circumstances beyond control of Sri Lanka, and erratic decision-making on part of the government of Sri Lanka, all have combined to create a situation where a combination of authoritarianism, populism, welfarism, and erratic policies have run into hard economic realities and popular anger, all resulting into what one can describe as a perfect storm. As you're aware, the growth rate in Sri Lanka was declining for last 10 years, since 2012. But many of the structural problems which have come to the fore now were present even earlier. There was this lopsided nature of Sri Lankan economy with excessive dependence on exports of tea, rubber, and garments, an inflow of remittances from Sri Lankan workers abroad. There was a very poor diversification of economy with very limited domestic capacities. Sri Lanka also depends to a great extent on imports of commodities ranging from fuel to daily use items, which has created a crisis when Sri Lanka has run into a major foreign exchange shortage. Looking back at the period I was serving in Colombo, one can say that even at that time, when President Mahinda Rajapaksa was doing his first term, economic growth was being fueled by heavy borrowings by government from abroad and domestically. Sri Lanka opted for infrastructure projects and populism and welfareism. It launched a series of vanity projects like Hambantota Port or Matala Rajapaksa International Airport, even Colombo City project, which were not based on economic viability or feasibility studies. All these projects which were funded or supported by China have unfortunately failed to result in dividends for the economy, and as a result have added to the vulnerabilities of the Sri Lankan economy and led to unsustainable public debt, including external debt. And the problem has been compounded by very limited revenue base of the Sri Lankan economy. On top of these legacy issues, we had two developments in 2019, which caused a major setback for the economy. I referred earlier to Easter Sunday bombings in April 2019, which resulted in a huge fall in flow of tourists. And as you know, tourism is a major source of both foreign exchange earnings and domestic revenue for Sri Lanka. To make matters worse, the new president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, was just taken over at that time in a very ill-advised move, cut VAT rates from 15% to 8%. In December 2019, abolished nation building tax and some of the levies. This led to a major fall in indirect tax collections, with VAT revenues falling by close to 50% in 2020. And then came the COVID pandemic in March 2020, with disastrous consequences for tourism, tea, rubber, and garment exports, as also for remittances from abroad of Sri Lanka. The government handled the COVID situation reasonably well. The impact was managed. There were also a number of welfare measures which were initiated, but these measures also led to further strains on the Sri Lankan economy. And the budget deficit increased to 10% of GDP. Public debt of Sri Lanka went up to as much as 119% of GDP by 2021, according to IMF figures. Foreign exchange reserves, which were about $7.5 billion towards the end of 2019, have shrunk to virtually zero at this point of time. Now, on top of all these issues, we had another big self-inflicted injury. In May 2021, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa opted for organic farming and banned import of chemical fertilizers. This was a disastrous policy, which led to a serious impact on food security, of Sri Lanka, export of items like tea and rubber, there was a massive outcry, and this decision was reversed. But it had already, resulted in considerable damage. According to some estimates, over the last 1 year, food grain production of Sri Lanka might have shrunk by as much as 50%. So it created, compounded problems that I have already referred to. You're all aware of recent developments in Sri Lankan economy. We have an acute shortage of foreign exchange reserves, as I mentioned earlier. This problem was also partly caused by a decision of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka to defend the Sri Lankan rupee vis-a-vis US dollar at artificially high level through major interventions in forex market, which was ill-advised. Then, I referred earlier to limited domestic capacities and dependence on imports for fuel, food, fertilizers, and daily use items. There is a major shortage of all these commodities, especially when Sri Lanka is unable to generate foreign exchange to buy these items from abroad. Sri Lanka, for instance, is unable to pay for fuel for power plants. As a result, there are power cuts of up to 15 hours. According to Central Bank of Sri Lanka, the inflation rate today is close to 40%. On 18th May, for the first time in its history, Sri Lanka defaulted on its sovereign debt commitments, which was an expected but unfortunate development. Now, I gave you this background of economic crisis that Sri Lanka is facing. In turn, this crisis has led to huge suffering on part of ordinary people and massive, discontent. Them triggering off a major political crisis. As you are aware, the Rajpaksha family has lost its Sinhala Buddhist constituency. In any case, the Rajpakshas had very limited support among the minority communities, Tamils, Muslims, and Christians. It depended primarily on its support base among the majority Sinhala Buddhist community. Now, even that support has imploded and virtually evaporated. Traditionally, Mahinda Rajpaksha in particular enjoyed support of something like 40 to 45% of the majority Sinhala community, which was reflected in the fact that in parliamentary elections in 2020, SLPP, Mahinda's party, and its allies got nearly 2/3 majority in the Sri Lankan parliament. But compared to that, today's situation is dramatically different. You're aware of protests which are taking place in Colombo over the last 2 months with Gota Go Gama, Gota Go Home demand, and protests, in fact, all over the country. And important and interesting aspect of this protest movement is that it's cutting across ethnic divide. So you have all communities, including the majority Sinhalese community, coming up to demand, that Rajpaksa's leave office. Mahinda Rajpaksha resigned on 9th May, and there's continuing demand for resignation of President Gotabaya Rajpaksha as well. The support for the current political dispensation, especially the Rajpakshas among the Buddhist Sangha or clergy, business community, unions, is at low ebb. So the situation had changed very drastically, dramatically over the last few months. Looking at the political scene within the Rajpaksha family, also fissures have built up. You're aware that in recent weeks, Basil Rajpaksha and Chamal Rajpaksha, two of the brothers, had to demit office. Mahinda Rajpaksha's son, Namal was also forced to resign. Finally, on 9th May, Gotabaya nudged Mahinda Rajapaksa to resign as Prime Minister. At that time, supporters of Mahinda Rajapaksa indulged in wanton violence directed against peaceful protesters on 9th May. On the evening of 9th and 10th May, there was retaliatory violence, which was clearly, well organized and targeted, which resulted in burning down of houses of something like 80, senior leaders of the ruling party. Prior to that, the protests were largely peaceful, but that changed on the night of 9th and 10th May. Though since then, once again, protests are largely peaceful. As you're aware, an interim government has been formed under leadership of Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe on 12th May. Now, the big question is Ranil man of the hour, given this critical situation that Sri Lanka is facing? He has both, strengths and weaknesses to deal with the present situation. He's experienced and he has relative acceptance in the international community, particularly in the West. Moreover, no one else was stepping up to the plate to take over the job of Prime Minister. The leader of opposition, Sajith Premdasa, who was invited to form government, refused until Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigned as president. So today you have a situation that Ranil, who was the sole MP of his party, UNP, has become the Prime Minister. He wanted to form a national unity government, but opposition parties, including SJP of Sajith Premdasa, they have refused to join the government. He has now formed a government cabinet with the support of SLPP, which is the party of Rajpaksas, and SLFP, which is another major party. But there are no doubts about the legitimacy of the present dispensation. There is continuing demand that Gotabaya should step down and that there should be systemic changes in Sri Lanka, that the nature of the constitution should undergo a thorough restructuring with shift away from executive presidency to parliamentary form of government. Now Gotabaya is not prepared to step down as president. Under the present constitution, he can be forced out of office only through impeachment, which is very difficult to achieve. And there's not support in parliament for that. Likewise, it's not feasible also to hold midterm elections in the near future. So we have to make do with the present interim dispensation in Sri Lanka, despite its shortcomings and deficiencies. And one must acknowledge that despite its limited and skewed political base, despite dependence of Ranil Wickremesinghe on SLPP and SLFP for getting majority support in parliament, his government has been able to provide a modicum of political stability, which was essential to deal with the economic and political crisis that the government is facing, that Sri Lanka is facing today. He has also promised that he will bring about the 21st Amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka, under which provisions of the 19th Amendment, which had diluted executive presidency and also introduced checks and balances, will be reintroduced, and the 20th Amendment will be rolled back. He has also talked about the abolition of executive presidency without giving any firm timeline or roadmap achieving that. We don't know when these major constitutional changes will be brought about, because as I mentioned, Ranil Wickremesinghe is dependent on SLPP and SLFP for political survival. And we don't know whether Gotabaya Rajapaksa will lend his support to a major overhaul of Sri Lankan constitution at the expense of his own political power and authority. Now, another issue which comes up from time to time is what's the role of armed forces in Sri Lanka in this political crisis. I was witness to a period when armed forces started playing a larger than life-size role in civilian space in Sri Lanka, particularly in the north and the east. Unfortunately, that trend has continued and even accelerated under the presidency of Gotabaya Rajapaksa. But at the same time, I don't think that Sri Lankan armed forces are inclined to directly intervene in politics of Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka is no Pakistan or Myanmar. So the possibility of introduction of something like martial law in Sri Lanka, to my mind, remains rather small. So today, the immediate challenge for the government led by Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe is to deal with the economic emergency that Sri Lanka is facing. This will require a number of very difficult economic decisions, as Ranil mentioned in his meeting with business chambers yesterday. During the rest of the year, Sri Lanka will be needing something like $5 billion for payments, another $1 billion to bolster its foreign exchange reserve. Where will this money come from? It's a huge challenge. Discussions have been initiated with the International Monetary Fund, but let me hasten to add that IMF assistance, though unavoidable and essential at this point in time, is no panacea. Since independence, Sri Lanka has gone for as many as 16 arrangements with IMF, including during the period 2016 to 2019. So IMF by itself will not be able to provide the magic bullet to deal with the problem Sri Lanka is facing. Sri Lanka will have to get help from other partner countries, including India, Japan, China, the Western countries, help from international financial institutions like the World Bank, ADB, and AIIB. All this will be required to kind of bridge, as bridge finance to get over the present economic emergency. Sri Lanka is presently cut out from international capital markets because it's for commercial borrowings due to its junk grade credit rating. So it has to depend either on international financial institutions or bilateral partners for getting emergency economic support. Now let me turn to role of India. India has assisted Sri Lanka in a manner which is perhaps unprecedented, even for us. This is in keeping with, as I mentioned earlier, India's neighborhood first policy. India has stepped in as a first responder, line of credit, and other arrangements that India has provided within this year since beginning of 2022 is about $3.5 billion. Additional support has been provided by government of Tamil Nadu and civic society organizations. Total assistance provided by India is about $6 billion. India has also rushed in petroleum products, food, medicines, and other essential commodities against credit lines. This has been well received by the people and the government in Sri Lanka, but it's only part of the answer to challenges that Sri Lanka is facing. And India also has one major challenge or tightrope walking when it comes to extending support to Sri Lanka. India would like to assist Sri Lanka to get over its economic crisis without being seen as propping up the Rajapakshas. This is something which has been done in a sophisticated manner, in a balanced manner over the last few weeks. I would like to refer in particular to an important statement made by official spokesman of Ministry of External Affairs, Arindam Bagchi, on 9th May 2022. He said that as a close neighbor of Sri Lanka with historical ties, India is fully supportive of its democracy, stability, and economic recovery. In keeping with our neighborhood first policy, India has extended this year alone support worth over $3.5 billion to the people of Sri Lanka for helping them overcome their current difficulties. In addition, the people of India have provided assistance for mitigating the shortages of essential items such as food, medicine, etc. India will always be guided by the best interests of the people of Sri Lanka expressed through democratic processes. Now, a point to note here is that the statement, which was rather well crafted, doesn't refer to the government of Sri Lanka at all. This statement talks only about the people of Sri Lanka, national interests of Sri Lanka, and democratic processes in Sri Lanka. The government of India would not want to be seen as interfering, but it, at the same time, it would like to, and it has done so, assist as the first responder or friend of first resort, and be seen as such across the political spectrum in Sri Lanka. So that's the basic approach. Now, coming to China, Chinese have been relatively cautious and biding their time. I would suggest that the present crisis is not a made in China crisis. It's made in Sri Lanka crisis. But Chinese have contributed to Sri Lanka's current predicament through number of acts of commission and omission. You're aware of projects which I referred to earlier, white elephants like Hambantota Port or Matala Airport or Port City project. These projects have mostly been supported through loans which were at commercial rate, which put a huge burden on Sri Lankan government exchequer. It also led to a debt trap in the sense that Sri Lanka had to hand over Hambantota Port on a 99-year lease to Chinese entity because it was not in a position to service loans, debt it owed to Chinese organizations and Chinese government. Coming to more recent period, on two counts, China has refrained from providing support to Sri Lanka. One, Sri Lanka needs debt restructuring. This is something essential for IMF package. India is willing to do that, but China has not indicated its readiness to go for debt restructuring. Instead, it's offering debt refinancing, which is quite different. Secondly, China has publicly opposed Sri Lanka approaching IMF for support, where again, India has been very supportive. In fact, Indian Finance Minister, when she was in Washington, DC a few weeks ago, had a meeting with the Managing Director of IMF, where she made a strong pitch for IMF providing emergency support to Sri Lanka. Now, contrary to perceptions in some quarters, India's proactive role and its support to Sri Lanka at this point of time is not largely because of a desire to balance China. Considerations are much broader. There are, of course, concerns about China's growing footprint in Sri Lanka, but India's policies are driven by broader considerations linked to its neighborhood first policy, as I referred to earlier. Sri Lanka is a country of immense strategic significance for India, and we would not like to see prolonged economic and political crisis there. So these are the considerations that India has, rather than a desire to balance China. I think that's a subsidiary factor at this point of time. But the whole situation will require careful handling on part of India. As I mentioned earlier, we have the challenge of providing support, at the same time not being seen as propping up the Rajpaksha regime. There has also been, while by and large, Indian role has been appreciated by the entire spectrum of political opinion and civic society in Sri Lanka. There has been some criticism about projects which were given to India in recent months. So on that count, India has been cautious since then. Here, I'll suggest that we need to remain closely engaged in Sri Lanka without getting directly involved in domestic politics of Sri Lanka in any mediatory role, while, of course, keeping in close touch with all parties. India has very carefully refrained from playing favorites. It has allowed the domestic processes to play out in Sri Lanka without intervening in any manner. Sri Lanka has to find solutions to its own problems through democratic processes. And this is not something where India can get involved. India's role will be limited to providing emergency assistance to Sri Lanka as first responder, but we cannot bail out Sri Lanka on our own. We are also limited resources, so we need to work with the rest of the international community to see that Sri Lanka gets over its present economic emergency. As the economic situation stabilizes, we'll have to look in the medium to long term and push ahead with projects in Sri Lanka, especially those involving private sector investments. These projects will generate economic activities without putting undue burden on Sri Lankan government exchequer. It's also important to fast track connectivity projects, including linking of electricity grids. If we had such an arrangement in place today, Sri Lanka would have perhaps avoided massive power shortages it's facing. Essentially, growth story of Sri Lanka can benefit from India's growth story and vice versa. So there has to be this intertwining of economies of India and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has to take advantage of its strategic location and its proximity to India, which will be this year the fastest growing large economy in the world. Now, one major problem Sri Lanka is facing today is the international apathy. You're aware of the preoccupation of the West with the war in Ukraine, which has sucked oxygen out of the system. There is very little appetite in the West to provide support to other countries. Ranil Wickremesinghe has suggested setting up Aid Sri Lanka consortium. India has not commented publicly on it so far. Generally, we have avoided getting into a donor kind of relationship because we are ourselves a developing country. So we opt for a partnership rather donor-donee arrangement with any of the countries in our neighborhood. In fact, the per capita income of Sri Lanka is more than that of India. But as I mentioned earlier, we have intervened with IMF to fast track support for Sri Lanka. We have also intervened with Japan and the G7 countries. At the last meeting of G7 finance ministers on 20th May, they issued a statement which calls for providing debt relief to Sri Lanka. Now, in conclusion, let me say that Sri Lanka will have a long and painful period of transition to get over its economic and political crisis. At the same time, I'm confident that Sri Lanka is a country with the requisite resilience and talent to overcome its multiple challenges. Once it has dealt with the economic emergency it's facing today, we'll have to look at a different model of economic development rather than one based on debt-fueled, unsustainable growth with loans from China and other countries. Sri Lanka must leverage its strategic location, as I mentioned earlier, as also its proximity with India, as well as its very impressive human resource endowments. The growth stories of Sri Lanka and India must be intertwined and mutually reinforcing. As I mentioned earlier, Sri Lanka must also reassess its majoritarian and Sinhala Buddhist agenda and opt for a more inclusive approach which brings on board minority communities as co-equal stakeholders. With such a course correction, I believe that Sri Lanka can and will have a bright future. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your optimistic views about the Sri Lankan crisis. We all are hoping for a bright future or a better future for Sri Lanka. We wish Sri Lanka will soon come out from its crisis. And I think, as I told you, this is not an mistake done by overnight. It's inefficiency of the government and instability of the political structure. This is the right time for Sri Lanka to get a change. And as we know, sir, the people of Sri Lanka, they are very frustrated by the inefficiency of government. They are demanding something changes in the government. Anyway, sir, thank you very much for your wonderful thought, and you motivated us. You gave a lot of information about the Sri Lankan crisis and how India can be helped, from the economic point of view, without interfering much in the political aspects of the Sri Lanka. Anyway, sir, it's really wonderful. Thank you so much. And sir, Professor Ponchalan, sir, I have a doubt. When Sri Lanka is facing, political or restructure, I hope it is required for Sri Lanka to have a restructure in political system to come out from the instability or, corruptive government. It's an inefficient government. Due to inefficient government, only peoples are under crisis. Then what do you say, sir? What is your opinion regarding this? How Sri Lanka is looking at India? What will be the future of political future of Sri Lanka, sir? What do you see, sir?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this wonderful and comprehensive presentation. It was like really thoughtful. Thank you for that. And as you guys know, I was here last week, so I don't want to repeat myself here. The recording is on YouTube. So I'll make one or 2 points about the ambassador's remarks, and then maybe try to answer Dr. Bharti's question. I agree with most of the points Ambassador made. I agree that the chances, Sri Lanka is not Pakistan or Myanmar, the chances of a military taking over is very minimal in Sri Lanka, but there's always a possibility of the closer relationship between political leaders and military, the possibility of the political leaders using military to control the system, the possibility is there. And also agree with the point that the crisis is not made in China. I have a friend who in the US who sent me an article yesterday written by one of the Sri Lankan commentators blaming the entire crisis on international forces, and asked me whether this opinion is widespread. And I said yes. Sri Lankans like to blame it on the at least some Sri Lankans like to blame it on the international forces. That is not true. Sri Lanka should take responsibility. It's mostly made in Sri Lanka. I agree with that. The India's role, Dr. Singh already suggested that he disagreed with me last week. I stand by my argument that India is helping Sri Lanka, at least partly. In my view, one of the main reasons is that helping Sri Lanka is crucial for India's national interest. So it's not, everything is not charity. National interest is a big part of the whole new equation right now. So maybe we can come back to that point. But one of the important points Ambassador made is that the need for greater connectivity between Sri Lanka and India. I agree, but we should also be mindful of the fact that there's considerable level of fear about India, especially within the majority Sinhala community. The minorities, the Tamils, of course, they would like to see India playing a greater role in Sri Lanka, but Sinhalese, one of the reasons why China was able to come in forcefully into Sri Lanka in the last 10 or 15 years is that there is no social resistance for China. That fear is relatively low. But when it come to India, at least within the Sinhala community, the fear is a little stronger. Therefore, there may be resistance to greater, very close partnership between India and Sri Lanka in the future. Back to Dr. Bharati's point about political reform. I think political reform is very important. As I indicated last week, the Constitution does not guarantee democratic ruling or good governance in Sri Lanka because it promotes authoritarianism. The embedded arrangements encourage the president and also the others to in a way abuse the power. That's one of the reasons for the crisis. Therefore, reform is very, very important. The question is whether to go back to the parliamentary system Sri Lanka had before 1978, or reform the existing presidential system. And as I understand from recent reports, there is resistance to completely removing the presidential system, because some, at least nationalist Sinhalese, believe the national presidential system is crucial for national security. Therefore, if someone tries to remove the presidential system, completely do away with it, and go back to the old parliamentary system, that would be tough. But reforming the presidential system would be relatively easy. That's where you have the 21st Amendment promoted by the present Prime Minister, who doesn't have any support in the parliament on his own. His party has only one seat. He's completely dependent on the SLPP. And last week I used the word in terms of explaining Ranil Wickremesinghe's current role. Maybe the process could be called condomizing Ranil Wickremesinghe, because SLPP would use Ranil Wickremesinghe to a certain extent, and then completely remove him, because he's entirely dependent on SLPP and SLFE. Therefore, his position is relatively weak. And as I pointed out last week, he has strength in terms of addressing the financial crisis. Is doing relatively okay. In the last 2 weeks, the situation is improving. As the situation improves, the social resistance goes down. Therefore, I think the last 2 weeks are relatively encouraging, but fingers crossed.
For your diplomatic answer. And again, sir, we have a Brigadier Rajkumar. Sir, what do you say, sir? What do you feel about the Sri Lankan crisis, sir, including political and economic crisis? What do you say, sir?
views as... am I audible, sir?
Yeah, sir.
Respected speakers here, sir. I totally endorse the views expressed by the Ambassador Ashok sir. I only smiled in between was when Dr. Kita mentioned about Sri Lanka and especially Sinhala being a little cautious when India vis-a-vis China. But I thought India, especially in Indian Army, I mean, though I'm a retired soldier now, we have been more to you, more than willing to help you out. In fact, I myself have a lot of students there who have taught motors and other course of instruction. So it was a little unnerving for me personally as a retired soldier. I thought we were much closer to you. And as Ashok sir brought out earlier, this crisis, if you ask me, I mean, you have invited crisis. We also have states who have got a lot of budgetary deficits there. But how does it happen? It is three things. I mean, like if you do a lot of tax aversion, then cutting out tax, rolling out freebies, and then it happens. And then naturally, when you invite somebody and you can't pay back, they will take something for you. And that's how Hemant Totas happened. You're given on a platter to them. So now the question is that India is trying as well. No, India is also going. In fact, the whole world is going through this post-pandemic and now the US or Ukraine crisis. So everyone has to find a solution, sir. And I thought India, the present government, everyone has gone out of the way to help out. And we also want political stability around the world. In fact, the three reasons our friendship is there is trade, which of course has come down because of the pandemic, and then political stability in the region. Dr. Kita, I know you've been very diplomatic, but you have to give that much to what Ashok has said. We are more than willing to help Sri Lanka out, but at the same time, you should understand even I need to look after my shirt, my backside. That's what I would say, sir. Ashok sir, can you please comment on that?
I think what Professor Kita said and Brigadier Rajkumar said, no, I agree with that. I think I have no problem with any of the comments they made on, India extending support to Sri Lanka, being the first responder in a crisis situation faced by one of our closest neighbors is partly guided national interest. There's no doubt about it. In international relations, it's not charity we engage in. As I mentioned in my remarks, interests of India and Sri Lanka, including in strategic, political, security, and economic domains, are closely interlinked. So if there is a crisis in Sri Lanka, it affects us very directly. And likewise, if the crisis in India, it will affect Sri Lanka. So when we are helping Sri Lanka as a partner, not as a donor, we are also, sort of helping our own neighborhood, which is in our interest. So I don't have any problem with that. On your issue, on your comment, Dr. Kita, about connectivity and reservations of the majority Sinhala community, I'm aware of that. I served in Sri Lanka for more than 3.5 years. But if you look at the matter objectively, there are two, or three big positive factors or facts in favor of Sri Lanka. One, of course, is a very strong social indicators, human resource development indicators that Sri Lanka has, which is the best in South Asia. There's no doubt about it. So you need to leverage that. Second is a strategic location, astride a major east-west maritime route. And third is proximity to India. It's not proximity to China, it's proximity to India. And India will continue to grow at a reasonably high growth rate in foreseeable future. It is in Sri Lanka's interest to take advantage of opportunities created by India's growth story. So connectivity is something, it's a no-brainer for Sri Lanka. If Sri Lanka doesn't want that, Sri Lanka will be the loser, not so much India. So I think people who are enlightened in Sri Lanka, they need to revisit some of the apprehensions that you referred to. But this is something Sri Lanka needs, the approach which President Mahinda Rajapaksa followed of going for large infrastructure projects based on debt from China, so Belt and Road Initiative projects or commercial borrowings, that has run aground. That approach is not going to work because there's such a huge debt burden Sri Lanka is carrying today. It needs to make a serious course correction, and that course correction will require both on the economic side, leveraging its strengths I referred to earlier, and on political side, moving away from an excessive dependence on majoritarian agenda. Bringing on board all communities so that they can contribute to Sri Lanka's growth story. I think that's something. It's not for India to interfere or intervene there, but that's something objectively speaking, one can say will be in Sri Lanka's interest.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I hope Brigadier sir is happy with us, sir. Very diplomatic answer. Sir, thank you, sir. And sir, our student have so many queries. They want to know more and more about the Sri Lanka because we have a course, sir, for master degree, political system, society and political system in South Asia. And Sri Lanka is also part of our course content. Then in that connection, our students are very eager to know what will be the future, what about the Sri Lanka. They want to know more from your side, sir. Then one of my students, Devika, she is ready to ask the question, sir. She have one query to you, sir. Devika?
Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Good evening, everyone. My name is Devika Janartha. I'm currently pursuing my master's in international relations from University of Mysore. My question is to Mr. Ashok sir. Could India become a top source of imports for Sri Lanka, provided India has been more reliable in this case?
I know we are already a major source of imports for Sri Lanka. Problem is not so much India's capacity to export to Sri Lanka. Capacity is there. There is a lot of complementarity in economies of India and Sri Lanka. But problem Sri Lanka is facing today is its ability to pay for its imports. So India has provided lines of credit for essential commodities like food and fuel imports from India. I think that's something which will continue. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has asked for additional funding support from India. I expect that some more support will be provided, but India's capacity is clearly limited. So Sri Lanka needs to look at other partner countries or institutions for bridge funding, which will be, as Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe mentioned yesterday, will be about $5 billion during the remainder of the year, which is a large amount. So India can't provide that on its own. And Sri Lanka needs to import essential commodities like food, fuel, fertilizers, medicines from abroad. So it's going to be a big challenge.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Devika, for your wonderful question. Sir, one of our students, Alok, he wants to know something about Sri Lanka, sir. Over to Alok.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alok. I am second year student in IR department, University of Mysore. Sir, my question is to Ashok, sir. Sir, first of all, sir, thank you so much for enlightening us with your immense knowledge. Sir, my question is, India is in a dilemma up to what extent it should invest in Sri Lanka to make its investment worth spending?
Alok, I mean, there are two kind of economic intervention. One is providing direct economic support through lines of credit or currency swap arrangement, etc., which we have been providing on an unprecedented scale. I mentioned that, as the spokesperson mentioned, within this year itself, it has been more than $3.5 billion. So I think, and I expect some more support to come from India. But as situation stabilizes in Sri Lanka, we need to focus on investment, especially by private sector in India. We have a very vibrant private sector. We have startups, as you're aware. India has the third largest number of unicorns, which are the billion-dollar unlisted companies in the world, next only to the USA and China. And many of these companies would like to expand their footprint in Sri Lanka. But that will require government of Sri Lanka also adopting a more welcoming approach. Plus, as I suggested earlier, creating more connectivity between economies of India and Sri Lanka. That's something which will benefit Sri Lanka immensely. I think, Dr. Iramat, you are muted.
My student, Vaishnavi. Vaishnavi, she's from first year post-graduation. She wants to know something about Sri Lanka, sir. Over to Vaishnavi. Vaishnavi, you can ask.
Good evening, sir. My name is Vaishnavi Rajma. I'm pursuing Masters in International Relations from University of Mysore. My question is to Ashok, sir. According to the respective budget estimates, states with the highest debt GSDP ratio in financial year of 2022 are Punjab 53.3%, Rajasthan 39.8%, West Bengal 38.8%, Kerala 38.3%, and Andhra Pradesh 37.6%. Are these states heading the Sri Lankan way? How can we learn from the present Sri Lankan economic crisis and arrest the increasing trend of the budgetary deficits?
I know, Vaishnavi, I'm not an economist, so I cannot give you a very, sort of well-informed answer to a question. But let me, point out that there are similarities and differences between situation in India, various states of India you referred to, and Sri Lanka. We also have a problem of fiscal and budgetary deficit, which can be unsustainable at times. So we need to learn within our means, which also involves eschewing recourse to populism, which is often the case in India because of political considerations. So I think that there's no doubt about it, that budgetary deficit in India, both at the central government level and states, is running a bit too high. So that needs to be controlled. But we have an advantage compared to Sri Lanka, that the revenue base of Indian economy is much larger. And we have foreign exchange reserves of $600 billion, which provides a cushion. And though we have current account deficit at present in our international transactions, it's manageable. We have very large inflow of foreign direct investment from outside. We are the largest recipient of remittances from abroad, number one in the world. So all those factors help us to bridge current account deficit that we have. Therefore, even though our public debt, both domestic and external, has been growing, we are at present nowhere close to an economic crisis. So it's still manageable as far as I can understand. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm not an economist, an expert in this area.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. So for your clarification, you made it very clear. And now one of the student, Penal, she also have a, information, doubt on Sri Lankan economic and political crisis. I will give it to Penal. Over to Penal. Penal.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, sir. First of all, thank you so much for being here and guiding us. I am Penal Trivedi. I am currently pursuing my MA in International Relations from Maharajas College, University of Mysore. Since 2013, under the aid of Belt and Road Initiative, China has made foreign aid and investment as a lead diplomacy tool. And trillions have been splurged by Beijing to buy influence in several countries. My question to you, sir, is if India and other like-minded countries were to counter this, what could be a preferred and viable model for it? And so could the Quad countries expand on the Blue Dot initiative?
You have referred to Belt and Road Initiative taken by China since 2013. So last 9 years, it has invested a lot in this initiative, but mostly it's through loans. These are loans coming from Exim Bank of China, China Development Bank, and other government-linked entities on terms which are essentially commercial in character. And these projects are initiated by the Chinese side. They're not so much based on initiative of the recipient countries. I referred to Sri Lanka earlier. I gave examples of projects like Hambantota Port, which is one of the least utilized harbors in the world. I referred to Matala International Airport, which has been described as the emptiest airport in the world. There are other projects which are not generating adequate returns because they were not based on economic viability study. So when we look at alternatives to BRI, I think we need to learn some lessons from mistakes made by the Chinese and shortfalls of BRI. Number one, these projects must be based on sound economics and environmental studies. They should not be vanity projects or projects which are sometimes driven by pure greed, corruption on part of leaders in the concerned countries. So economic viability, environmental sustainability, fact that they are driven and motivated by the host countries, I think these are very important. So experience of Sri Lanka, in fact, becomes a cautionary tale when we craft an alternative to BRI. But so far, I must acknowledge that whether it's India or USA or Japan or other like-minded countries, they have not been able to come up with either requisite funding or a framework which fulfills the huge deficit in terms of infrastructure needs in various developing countries. So we need to do far more. You referred to Blue Dot initiative. It hasn't really taken off so far. So I think problem partly lies on side of on part of countries like USA, Japan, and India, because we have not been able to generate either adequate funds or provide the requisite framework to address limitations of BRI.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful answer for panel question. Sir, we also have an eminent scholar, Professor Anil Borkar from Arunachal, University of Arunachal. Department of Economics. He wants to know something about the economical issues on Sri Lanka, sir. Sir, Mr. Anil?
Yes, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, sir. Sir, actually, I have seen that in topic economic and political crisis of Sri Lanka. That's why I am connected. And my question is regarding to economic aspects. So, is it possible to discuss that question, that type of questions here?
Yeah,
economic
please,
related.
Please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Sir, you can see the previous history of the economic crisis or all over world. Most of the crises are demand-sided crisis, right? Except this last crisis, worldwide crisis, which is the COVID-19 led crisis, it was a supply-side crisis, right? But in Sri Lankan case, there are two types of, both the types of crisis are there. Supply-side crisis is there, and the demand-side crisis is also there. Along with that, what we can say, the confidence level of the market is very low. And besides, if you none of the policy you can find that which will encourage or boost that economy, like if you take a fiscal policy or you take type of monetary policy, monetary instruments, these both the types of policy and all the types of instrument economic models, I think it's not relevant. And as you said that what we can say, India's resources are limited to help Sri Lanka. If it is limited, but India can help totally. But if it is not, they are evolved or they are not trying to get boost themselves, it will be the very difficult. So my question is that which type of economic point of view can encourage that type of crisis, because historically it is a very what we can say ambiguous situation have find in this current Sri Lankan economic crisis.
Dr. Bokar, in my initial presentation, I tried to explain that economic crisis that Sri Lanka is facing today, which in turn has triggered off a political crisis, is partly based on legacy issues, problems which were building up for quite some time, a certain economic development model which had its limitations and vulnerabilities that Sri Lanka had followed. Those problems were compounded by circumstances largely outside, beyond Sri Lanka's control, including the COVID pandemic and the Ukrainian crisis, including the war in Ukraine. So they compounded the problem. And third contributing factor has been a series of mistakes made by Government of Sri Lanka, by Central Bank of Sri Lanka in various areas, including its fiscal policy, where tax rates were cut down drastically, leading to revenue base shrinking almost overnight, or even foreign exchange policy, where then Governor of CBSL, Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Ajit Reward Cabral, sought to defend Sri Lankan rupee at an exchange rate vis-a-vis US dollar, which was unsustainable. So it was pegged at a rate, so it led to wasting the foreign exchange reserves. So a number of these contributing factors are there. The answer will not be easy. If Sri Lanka has to go for the IMF support, which it has started negotiating, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has mentioned that he hopes to have some kind of agreement by end of this month. Sri Lanka will have to take a number of very difficult decisions, including increasing tax rates, cutting down on expenditure, more targeted welfare schemes. Already it has raised interest rate quite significantly. It has allowed Sri Lankan rupee to float. All those steps will have to be continued. And indeed, more painful decisions will have to be taken. So that's one aspect. Second, we'll have to generate bridge finance to get over the present crisis. Third aspect, which I explained in some detail earlier, it will have to really revisit its basic economic development strategy and go for something which is more sustainable, which is based more on investment by private sector rather than by government, going for large vanity projects.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I hope Mr. Anil is happy with this response from our ambassador. Sir, once, we also have a question from Saheli, sir. She is also studying, first year. Then I will ask a panel. There is a question in chat box, sir. I will ask a panel to read out, sir.
The question is from Karthik from Political Science Department, and his question is to Ashok, sir. His question is, thank you for that insightful session, sir. You spoke about the South Bloc prioritizing the neighborhood first policy as the crisis unfolds in Sri Lanka. But our engagement with a few partners in our immediate periphery is becoming reactive, specifically to the growing influence of China. Drawing lessons from the Sri Lankan crisis and changes from around 2008, is there any lessons that the South Bloc has to learn?
I tried to explain earlier that the rationale or logic behind India's Sri Lanka policy today derives only partly from a desire to, sort of counter China. That's part of our concern, no doubt about it. But essentially, we believe that we can't afford to have a prolonged economic or political crisis in Sri Lanka, because that will be destabilizing for the region as a whole. India, when it comes to its neighborhood and extended neighborhood, had tried to be the first responder in difficult situations, whether it be natural disasters or for instance what happened in Nepal earlier, or economic contingencies like what Sri Lanka is facing today. So this is not a new policy. We do it in a non-reciprocal manner. So we don't expect that our partner countries will give something back in return. We believe that vital interests of India and its neighborhood are closely interlinked. So it's in our interest also that there should be prosperity, stability, and growth in our neighborhood, because that benefits us. There is, as Dr. Kita rightly pointed out, India is not acting out of charity. A strong, stable, prosperous Sri Lanka is in our national interest. So I think that's the policy we have been following. Now, what lessons we have learned, whether we have been reactive? Yes, in some situations we have been reactive. We have made some mistakes as well. There's no doubt about it. But my own feeling is that when we deal with our neighborhood, we need to build on our strengths rather than our apprehensions. And our strengths is that there are natural synergies between India and its neighboring countries, with the exception of Pakistan, which falls in a different category altogether for different reasons. We need to leverage those synergies. We need to take advantage of those affinities, the connectivities I referred to. That should be the basic plank of our approach, rather than trying to match China in terms of projects. Chinese economy is 5 times as big as India's economy. So we can't possibly, match China. So we work on our strengths rather than just trying to imitate China in terms of its outreach to our neighborhood.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful and valuable information regarding Sri Lankan crisis, political and economic as well. And for India and Sri Lanka, it's not a new thing, sir. New thing in the sense, not in terms of crisis, I'm telling, in terms of relationships. Since ancient period, it's a long history. We have a long historical relations. And as an immediate neighboring country, each should know and each should be ready to help in a critical condition. As our panelist, Ambassador Ashok sir told, India should deal very diplomatically without interfering much in a political aspects. Of course, it's not a time to have an interfere or not to interfere in a political issues. As in a neighboring country, as an elder brother, we can help, or India can help, can give the assistance to Sri Lanka to come, financial assistance or any other assistance to come out from crisis. And also we wish Sri Lanka will come out with great result, or with great fruitful result in future. It also will have a stable government, stable economic conditions. And with this hope, already we are running time. It is a time to have a vote of thanks. And also, thank you for all the panelists, Professor Kita Ponchalan and Brigadier Rajkumar sir and Dr. Binod sir, having an great vision. So Binod sir also having a great vision with Sri Lanka and India, having a collaboration. We had a discussion on this platform, sir. Thank you, Ponchalan sir. Thank you, Ashok sir, for giving a valuable information to our students, sir. Thank you, sir. Now we have a formal vote of thanks. It is on cultural ethics. Sir, I will give it to Saheli to give a formal vote of thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Very good evening to all. It's my pleasure to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of Mysore Global Forum. First and foremost, I would like to thank Professor G. Hemant Kumar, Vice Chancellor of University of Mysore, and Professor Anita Bimla Braggs, ma'am, Principal of Maharaja College, for their constant support. I take my sincere pleasure in extending my heartfelt thanks to our first panelist, Dr. Ashok K. Kanta, Director of Chinese Studies, Delhi, who despite of his busy schedule has found time to grace this event. We are really delighted to have you, sir. Thank you so much for being with us. I would also like to thank our second panelist, Dr. S.I. Kita Ponchalan, Professor of Conflict Resolution in Salisbury University, Maryland, US, for his valuable presence. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. We are extremely happy to have you again. I would like to also thank Brigadier Rajkumar sir for joining us today. A special thanks to Dr. Vinod Singh sir, Director of BRICS Institute, for his constant guidance and support. I also must give my heartfelt thanks to our head and coordinator, Dr. Bharati Hiramat, for giving us this opportunity. A special thanks to Dr. Chandanayakar sir, coordinator of IOE, for helping us. Last but not the least, I would like to thank the teaching faculty of our department, students and dignitaries who have joined us from all over the world, and obviously the students of International Relations Department for making this event a successful one. Before ending, I'm glad to announce that next week, we are also having another panel discussion on the topic, India's energy security and West Asia. Once again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Master Sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So we want to see you in Mysore, sir. You all are warmly welcome to Mysore, sir.
We'll be happy to take your invitation. We'll be there.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Professor Ponchalan, sir.
Ma'am, we need to invite Ambassador sir on India, China sometime, please.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Whenever sir is comfortable. No, not very. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Because
He's the man.
I just want to add one thing. When sir was there in the presence of our Prime Minister, we signed more than 23 billion of investment, Chinese investment in India. So like it picked up like anything. And I was also there in Shanghai at that time. And I mean, after he left, we had Doklam, we had Galwan, we had a lot of issues. So basically, if sir is willing to join back diplomacy, so India will benefit a lot.
Thank you, Vinod.
Even the students like us will benefit, sir.
No. Good interacting with all of you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Partiji.
Thank you, sir, for your great interaction with our student. Thank you, sir, once again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Vinod sir, आपने पूछा नहीं कुछ आज. I was waiting for your question. In fact,
he was my boss there.